Well, some Democratic governors who have historically followed federal COVID-19 guidance are starting to lift mask orders. A new article in the Boston Globe takes a look at this political shift and what's driving it. James Pindell wrote that piece. He's a political reporter for the Boston Globe, and he's here to talk with us some more about this. So this is really interesting, and I'm trying not to be cynical about this, right? I'm trying to be like, they're following the science. It has nothing to do with politics. But throughout the pandemic, it's generally been Republican governors who have imposed, say, looser restrictions, or who have, sort of poo-pooed these general shutdowns and that sort of thing. And the Democrats have said, no, we have to follow the science. What do you make of this shift? What does this say to you?
Yeah, I think it's important to note that heading into this week, where we've had some dramatic changes that we're about to talk about, that well over half of the states didn't have indoor mask mandates. It's just a select few. And all those select few happen to be deeply Democratic states, where that's where a lot of the constituents wanted these restrictions in place. And often there are Democratic governors leading Democratic states, so it's very safe. But this week we saw a dramatic shift. And you could say that it was the perfect coincidence, or is the collision of two different things. One is following the numbers of coronavirus cases, where Omicron seems to be leaving a lot of these states as quickly as it came. And second is, a lot of the politics here. There's a new Monmouth poll, Monmouth University poll, showing that 70% of Americans now believe that COVID's here to stay, and it's time for us to figure out how we're going to live with it. That included about 90% of Republicans, 71% of independents, and almost half of even Democrats. The politics here, heading into a midterm year, are quite obvious, and you can't ignore them. But you also really can't ignore that the numbers are dropping dramatically as well.
But here's the question, James. I understand that there will be some people who are going to look at these moves by some of these Democratic governors and say, you see, what Republicans were saying a year ago or a year and a half ago is now all of a sudden true because the science has changed, right? But the reality is the science has changed. We've learned more about this virus, and people are vaccinated now. So the criticism, I worry that the criticism that it will be directed at politicians, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, has nothing to do with the science and everything to do with the politics, when there is some science here.
Except I'm going to throw one little thing here. The CDC is still not saying, all right, drop your masks, right? And prior to this, a lot of these governors were saying, we're just following the CDC guidance. Well, that's not the CDC guidance yet.
Right, the CDC guidance is to keep the masks on.
Right.
But as James points out, they're seeing the poll numbers, James.
That's true, and I'm glad you make a very good point. This is not suggesting that KN95 masks don't work. They do work. But what has changed on the ground is a lot. We now have a pandemic that is largely among the unvaccinated. So we have vaccinated folks who say, look, the chances of me getting sick are smaller, dramatically smaller, and the chances of me, if I do get COVID, of actually dying from COVID, are really low. So how can I move on with life? And then you have the unvaccinated who've already made that decision that they're willing to move on with life and accept some risk in the first place. So that's where we're at. Further, again, the masks do work, but the case counts and where COVID is at right now is not as dramatic as it was even in December. And we may have to put masks back on. No governor saying we won't have to do that if things reemerge. And then third, we have more ability to treat the disease if someone gets it. That is not where we were a year and a half ago. If Ron DeSantis wants to say I was right all along, then we are in a completely different situation right now than we were way back when.
So I was curious about how people in New York were going to react to the news, right? That you can take your mask. So I'm going down to the train station, and pretty much everyone still has their masks on,
well,
right?
It's interesting, right? That I noticed that too, James and Anne-Marie, that in blue states where there were some stricter measures put into place, and people are fully vaccinated and boosted, they tend to be still a little bit more fearful than in states where they had no mandates and people are not as vaccinated.
So I'm actually curious about what it's like where you are. It's a blue state, very popular governor, Charlie Baker. He announced this week that the state's school mask mandate will be lifted later on this month. How are people receiving this news in political circles there?
Yeah, look, he's a Republican governor. He's been pretty popular throughout, and obviously a very Democratic state. Again, What's different between what we've been seeing this week from blue state governors and what has happened with red state governors is different. Red state governors are saying local communities, you cannot put in mask mandates. In this case, it's, in the case of Massachusetts, next month, communities, you can decide to lift them. It's your decision at the local level. So there is something different. We are seeing some school districts, for example, by the way, the announcement in Massachusetts, the most dramatic would be schools. You no longer have to wear a mask in school beginning on March 1st. We've already seen some communities, hard-hit communities like one named Chelsea, just north of Boston, who've already announced that they are going to keep the mask mandate in their schools. That's their decision. I think we're going to see other communities making that decision. But overall, it's been treated pretty popularly. In Boston, by the way, still has a mask mandate for restaurants and all that, but they may make a different decision later. But the current mayor, who's a new mayor, has said there's nothing directly on the timeline when she may lift that mask mandate.
It's really fascinating, and I ultimately wonder if it's hard to do now, but looking back, if we hadn't made mask wearing so political in the early days, then you probably wouldn't have had to implement mandates in the first place, right? If it hadn't been a political issue from the jump. James, thank you so much as always. We appreciate it. Really excellent reporting. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.